"Sir, I think you're in the wrong section." That sentence followed him before he even sat down. A tired black man, a worn-out jacket, a boarding pass nobody bothered to check. They didn't see a passenger, they saw a problem, and they were already deciding how to make him disappear. Caleb Wright had flown hundreds of times before, private jets, charter flights, long-haul international runs. But this flight felt different, not because of where he was going, because of how he was being seen. The cabin was quiet in that polished, expensive way. Soft lighting, cream-colored seats, the low hum of the engines wrapped in luxury. Everything looked calm. Everything smelled like money. And yet, the air was cold. Not cold in temperature, cold in posture. Cold in the way people avoided looking directly at him, then looked again just long enough to decide something. Caleb walked slowly down the aisle of the business-class cabin. Not rushed, not unsure, just tired. He had a jacket that had seen better years, a face that carried long nights and early mornings, the kind of tired that doesn't come from travel, but from responsibility. His boarding pass was digital, his seat was valid, everything about his presence was correct, except the way people reacted to it. A woman paused her conversation when he passed. Her voice dropped. Her eyes followed him just long enough to make sure he noticed. 2 rows ahead, a man shifted in his seat, not because Caleb was in the way, but because something about him felt out of place. Caleb noticed all of it. He always did. You learn to. He found his seat and sat down quietly. No complaint, no announcement. Just presence. A flight attendant walked past without making eye contact. Then another. Then another. In business class, that almost never happens. This was the part most people never talk about. The small pauses, the delayed glances. The way service becomes selective before it becomes hostile. No one said anything yet, but something had already shifted. Caleb placed his bag under the seat and leaned back. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, to breathe. The cabin felt like a room that had already made a decision. Behind the scenes, everything was moving with precision. Beverage carts prepared, meals counted, names checked. But Caleb's name wasn't being said with neutrality. It was being said with hesitation. A junior attendant slowed when she reached his row. She glanced at the seat number, then at him, then at the tablet in her hand. She didn't stop. She kept moving. That pause was barely a second, but it carried weight. Across the aisle, a couple whispered, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to confirm something between them. Caleb opened his eyes, not in surprise, in recognition. This wasn't new. It was familiar. The quiet version of exclusion. In places like this, power didn't shout. It nodded. It delayed. It withheld. Luxury spaces weren't built to reject people directly. They were built to make people feel they rejected themselves. Minutes passed. Water was served to the row behind him, then the row ahead. His row was skipped. Not forgotten. Skipped. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't clear his throat. He waited, because experience had taught him something simple. In spaces like this, the smallest request could become the first accusation. A different attendant approached, this one older, more practiced. She looked at Caleb. Her eyes flickered, then hardened into professionalism that felt rehearsed. "Sir, we'll be with you shortly." Not rude, not warm, neutral in tone, judgment in posture. Caleb nodded. Around him, service moved like choreography. Glasses clinked softly. Menus unfolded. Names were spoken with warmth. Just not his. The cabin was full of motion. and he was standing still inside it. This was how invisible walls were built. Not with rules, with assumptions. No one had asked him a question yet, but a narrative had already formed. That was the power of a closed space. Once the story is written, everyone starts acting like it's fact. The seats were wide, the lighting was soft, the silence was curated. But underneath it all was tension. The kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that waited. Caleb shifted slightly in his seat, not out of discomfort, out of awareness. This wasn't about service anymore. It was about placement. Who belonged, and who had to justify being there. A tray clattered softly nearby. Someone laughed quietly 2 rows ahead. Life continued. But around Caleb, time felt paused. Another attendant passed. This one didn't look at him at all. That was louder than any insult. Caleb folded his hands and rested them on his lap. Not in submission, in control. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to perform. He was here to observe. In closed systems, power reveals itself in what it delays, in what it avoids, in who it makes wait. And right now, the system was making him wait. Not for water, not for food, for acknowledgement. That was the real currency. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, a signal that service would begin. Finally. An attendant approached his row again. She stopped this time. Her eyes moved over him, not quickly, not kindly. Professionally curious, personally skeptical. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" Not because it was required, but because it was convenient. Caleb unlocked his phone and turned the screen toward her. She glanced at it, longer than necessary. Her jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed. "Thank you." She didn't apologize. She didn't smile. She walked away. The cabin exhaled, but not in relief, in confirmation. Something had been checked. Something had been validated. But not him. The system. This was how invisible authority worked. It never asked if it was right, only if it was safe. Caleb leaned back in his seat again, still calm, still silent. But now the room had fully noticed him. And once a closed space notices you, it never looks at you the same way again. Service didn't stop, it just stopped reaching him. The cart rolled down the aisle again. Glasses clinked, ice cracked. Laughter floated from 2 rows ahead. Caleb watched it pass his seat without slowing. No apology, no explanation. Just movement that curved around him like he wasn't there. Vanessa Cole stood near the pantry, arms crossed, eyes scanning the cabin. She wasn't loud, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power doesn't announce itself, it positions itself. She tilted her head slightly toward Eric Nolan. A small gesture, almost nothing. Eric followed her gaze, then looked at Caleb, then back at Vanessa. His jaw tightened. He picked up a glass, then set it back down. He hesitated. "Row 12 first," Vanessa said quietly. Not a command, a direction. Eric nodded. Caleb watched the water being poured for someone behind him, then for someone across the aisle, then for someone in front. When Eric reached Caleb's row, he paused. "Can I get some water, please?" Caleb asked. Not demanding, not raised, just a request. Eric looked at him, then at the tablet in his hand, then over his shoulder toward Vanessa. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. "We're a little behind right now," Eric said. "I'll come back." He moved on. The cabin didn't react. No gasps, no discomfort. Because this wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Minutes passed. Caleb folded his hands again, still calm, still quiet. A meal tray was placed on the table beside him. Not his, for the passenger next to him. The smell of warm food filled the air. Caleb looked down at his empty tray. Nothing was missing. Everything was being withheld. Vanessa took a step closer now, close enough to be seen. Not close enough to be questioned. She leaned slightly toward Eric. "Make sure we keep things orderly," she said. Orderly. That word carried weight. Eric nodded again, more quickly this time. He skipped Caleb's row again, not by accident, by pattern. This was the moment where inconvenience became intention. Caleb shifted in his seat just slightly, not in protest, in acknowledgement. He had been seen, and he had been categorized. A voice broke the quiet from across the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" Richard Moore asked. He was well-dressed, relaxed, comfortable in the space like it had been built for him. Vanessa turned toward him with practiced warmth. "Not at all, sir. Just making sure everything runs smoothly." Richard glanced at Caleb, then back at Vanessa. "Some people don't understand how these cabins work," he said. His tone was light, almost amused. Vanessa smiled politely. Eric stood frozen between them. Caleb met Richard's eyes. No challenge, no submission, just stillness. Richard looked away first. He settled back into his seat, satisfied. That was enough for Vanessa, the approval of someone who belonged. Eric exhaled quietly. He turned back to the cart, but this time, he didn't even pretend. He passed Caleb's row without slowing. No water, no menu, no acknowledgement. Just a clean decision. This was how power grew, not in confrontation, in comfort. Sabrina wasn't here, but Vanessa was, and Vanessa was the kind of person who didn't need cruelty to feel in control. She only needed compliance. Sabrina was not born cruel, neither was Vanessa. They were shaped by something much quieter, a form of power so small it rarely gets named. Micropower. The kind that lives in hallways and front desks and service counters. The kind that decides who gets answered first, who gets questioned, who gets delayed. It doesn't wear a badge. It doesn't need a title. It exists in permission. The person who opens the door, the person who checks the list, the person who decides if you're allowed. They don't own the system, but they represent it. And when no one is watching, that representation becomes judgment. Vanessa didn't think she was doing harm. She believed she was maintaining standards, protecting order, preserving an image. She believed she was doing her job. That's how most injustice begins. Not with hatred, with comfort in authority. When you grow used to people waiting for you, you stop seeing them as equal. When you grow used to being obeyed, you forget what accountability feels like. Vanessa wasn't a villain. She was a warning, a reminder that any position of small control left unchecked can become a place where dignity is rationed. Eric felt it. He knew something was wrong. But knowing isn't the same as stopping. He was new, uncertain, watching his future balance on Vanessa's approval. So he followed her lead. That was how micropower multiplied. Not through cruelty, through fear. Fear of losing status, fear of losing work, fear of standing alone. Caleb remained silent, not because he had no voice, but because he understood something deeper. This wasn't about service anymore. It was about hierarchy. And hierarchies reveal themselves in what they deny. The cart reached the end of the aisle. Vanessa checked her watch. She looked at Eric again. "Let's hold off on that row," she said quietly. That row. Not his name, not his seat. A category. Eric nodded. The decision was sealed. The cabin felt different now, not tense, organized. A system had made a choice, and systems protect themselves. That was the other truth most people never see. When something goes wrong inside a closed space, the instinct is not to ask who was harmed. It's to ask who might be blamed. Airplanes, hospitals, schools, courts, they all run on procedure. And procedure is designed to preserve structure first. Not fairness, not dignity, structure. That's why when a mistake happens, the first reaction is not correction, it's defense. Vanessa wasn't acting alone. She was acting with the quiet permission of silence. Richard's comment, Eric's obedience, the absence of interruption, and above all, the cockpit. Captain Howard Blake sat behind a closed door, monitoring, informed. He had received a brief update, not details, just a tone. Minor situation in the cabin. Minor. He didn't ask for more. He trusted the system, the chain, the hierarchy. That trust was the shield. Because if the cockpit didn't intervene, the cabin's version of truth became official. This wasn't one person making a decision. It was many people choosing not to stop it. That was the real escalation. Caleb waited, not because he was powerless, but because the story had to write itself fully. He watched the system move around him, justify itself, support itself. Vanessa returned to her station. She looked satisfied, not victorious, just aligned. Richard sipped his drink. Eric avoided eye contact. The cabin settled into routine again. But something had changed. What began as neglect had become policy. What began as hesitation had become authority. Caleb was no longer being overlooked. He was being managed. And once a system decides to manage you, everything you do becomes evidence. Silence becomes suspicious. Calm becomes defiance. Patience becomes resistance. This was how small power learned to speak. Quietly, collectively, confidently. And the cabin, without realizing it, had already chosen a side. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible. A rule was mentioned. A protocol was referenced. A tone changed. And suddenly, this wasn't about service anymore. It was about control. Caleb pressed the call button once. Not impatient. Not dramatic, just precise. A soft chime echoed in the cabin. No one came. He waited. The light stayed on. A few seats away, Vanessa noticed it. She didn't rush. She didn't react. She let the light exist. That was the message. Caleb pressed it again. Eric glanced toward the panel, then toward Vanessa. She was already watching him. He stood up, slowly, reluctantly. Not because he wanted to help, because he had been released to act. He approached Caleb's seat, but didn't lean in, didn't smile, didn't soften his voice. "Yes, sir?" Caleb looked up. "I've been trying to get some water," he said, still calm, still steady. Eric nodded. "We're prioritizing some other needs right now." Not a lie, just incomplete. Caleb glanced around. 2 rows ahead, glasses were being collected. Behind him, dessert menus were already being offered. "Am I not a priority?" Caleb asked. Eric hesitated. That pause lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Vanessa stepped closer. "There's been a concern," she said, her voice low, professional. "A concern about what?" Caleb asked. Vanessa didn't answer directly. She turned slightly toward Eric. "Let's document this." Document. That word changed everything. Caleb straightened. Document what? Vanessa lifted her tablet. Behavior, interaction, tone. 3 words, none of them real, all of them dangerous. Caleb looked around. No one was watching, or maybe everyone was. "I asked for water," he said. Vanessa nodded. "And we're noting your reaction." That was the moment. The moment service became suspicion. Eric tapped something into the device, slowly, carefully. Caleb saw the screen reflect in his glasses. No details, just a field being filled. A record was being created. "You're creating a report?" he asked. Vanessa met his eyes. "Standard procedure." Standard. The most powerful word in any closed system. Caleb leaned back slightly. "So now I'm being reported for asking for water?" Vanessa didn't answer. She didn't have to. The system had already begun speaking for her. Across the aisle, Richard Moore shifted in his seat. He had been watching longer than he admitted. "Is there an issue?" he asked. Vanessa turned to him immediately. "A minor one. We're addressing it." Richard glanced at Caleb, then at Vanessa. "Well, I did notice he's been tense." Tense. A word that could mean anything. Eric looked up. Vanessa nodded. "That's helpful. Helpful." Now there were 2 voices. Caleb looked at Richard. "You noticed me being tense," he said. Not accusing, not raised, just stated. Richard shrugged. "In this environment, people need to stay calm, that's all." Environment. As if calm were a requirement only some people had to prove. Vanessa turned back to Eric. "Add that." Eric hesitated, then typed. 2 confirmations. That was all it took. Caleb was no longer a passenger, he was an entry. Vanessa's posture changed, slightly more upright, slightly more certain. "I'm going to ask you to remain seated," she said. Caleb looked up. "I am seated. And keep your interactions minimal." Minimal. Another word that meant restriction without saying it. Caleb folded his hands. "Am I being accused of something?" Vanessa paused. Not long enough to stop, long enough to frame. "There's concern about disruption." Disruption. A word that could become anything. Caleb exhaled. "So now I'm disruptive?" Richard leaned forward. "I've flown hundreds of times," he said. "When someone starts pushing staff, it creates risk." Pushing. Caleb hadn't moved. Vanessa nodded again. "Thank you, sir." 3 confirmations. That was no longer opinion. That was evidence. Eric's fingers hovered over the screen, then tapped. The record was complete. Caleb felt it. Not emotionally, structurally. Something had shifted. He was no longer asking for service. He was being managed. "Am I in danger of being removed from this flight?" he asked. Vanessa looked at him carefully now. "That depends on how you proceed." There it was. The threat without the threat. Caleb looked around. No one spoke. No one objected. The cabin was silent in the way silence becomes consent. Eric stepped back. Vanessa raised her voice just slightly. "Captain Blake has been informed." Informed. Not consulted, not asked. Informed. Caleb's jaw tightened. "What exactly did you inform him of?" he asked. Vanessa didn't answer. She turned and walked toward the pantry. That was another message. The conversation was over. The authority had moved upward. and now the weight was no longer hers alone. Caleb sat still. He felt eyes on him now, not curious, not sympathetic, evaluating. He was no longer a guest. He was a variable. A chime sounded from the cockpit, not loud, not urgent, just a signal that communication had been received. Vanessa returned. Her tone had shifted, not softer, stronger. "The captain is monitoring the situation," she said. Monitoring. That word meant surveillance. Caleb nodded. "So I'm under observation now." Vanessa met his eyes. "Let's keep it from escalating." Escalating, as if he had started anything. Richard leaned back comfortably. "People need to understand there are consequences for behavior," he said. Consequences. Caleb looked at him. "What behavior?" Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. The accusation existed because it had been spoken, not because it had been proven. Vanessa turned to Eric. "If there are any further concerns, initiate security protocol." Security protocol. The heaviest phrase on the plane. Eric swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." That was when the line was crossed. Not visibly, not loudly, but definitively. From inconvenience to accusation. From bias to threat. Caleb sat motionless, not because he was afraid, because he understood something. Rules had stopped protecting him. They were now pointed at him. He had not been aggressive. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved from his seat. And yet a system was assembling around him. One confirmation, then another, then authority. This was how it worked. Not with handcuffs, with language. Not with force, with documentation. Vanessa stood taller now. Her decisions carried weight. Eric avoided Caleb's eyes. Richard sipped his drink. The cockpit stayed silent, and the cabin, in its stillness, had transformed a passenger into a risk. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because the system had found a way to make him look like he had. This was no longer about rules. This was about power using rules as a weapon. And once that happens, innocence becomes irrelevant. Because in a closed space, whoever controls the narrative controls reality. Caleb understood that, and the cabin, without realizing it, had just declared him a problem that needed to be handled. Back in the cockpit, the tone was different. Not loud, not urgent, just precise. Captain Blake listened as the message came through, not from the cabin, from the system. A soft alert appeared on his console, an internal flag, routine at first glance. He adjusted his headset. "What's the source?" he asked. The reply was quiet, almost casual. "Passenger feedback protocol, automatic quality monitor." Blake frowned slightly. That system was new, still in testing, still selective. He tapped the screen. The name appeared. Caleb Wright. He froze, just for a second. Then he checked again. Same name, same spelling, same profile tag. His posture changed. He didn't speak. He didn't react outwardly. But something in the air shifted. Because that name wasn't just a passenger name. It was a boardroom name, a contract name, a signature that moved companies. Blake knew it. Everyone at the executive level knew it. He opened the file. Not a complaint, not a report, a live evaluation. The system was doing what it had been designed to do. Watching, recording, judging. Not the passenger, the crew. Back in the cabin, Vanessa felt it before she understood it. Her tablet vibrated once. Not a message, A sync. She glanced at the screen. Her expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that comes when you realize the room has been watching you, not the other way around. Eric noticed. "Is something wrong?" he whispered. Vanessa didn't answer. She scrolled. The interface wasn't showing Caleb's profile. It was showing her actions. Timestamps, tone markers, protocol deviations. Her name was attached. She looked up at Caleb. For the first time, not as a problem, but as a variable she hadn't calculated. Caleb was still seated, still calm, still quiet. He hadn't moved. But now, the system had. Another vibration. Eric's device lit up too. He swallowed. "What is this?" he asked. Vanessa read the header. "Live compliance audit." Her voice dropped. Eric's hands trembled slightly. That's only supposed to run during training." Vanessa didn't look at him. "It's always running," she said. "We just don't usually get flagged." Back in the cockpit, Captain Blake cleared his throat. "Confirm the identity attached to this evaluation." The response came quickly. "Caleb Wright, founder and majority stakeholder of Wright Aero Logistics, lead architect of the FAA service quality automation model currently in pilot phase." Blake closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. He had chosen silence earlier. Now, silence was no longer an option. In the cabin, Richard Moore leaned back comfortably. He had no idea. He was still operating inside the old story. Vanessa straightened. Her authority had evaporated without a word. Eric looked at Caleb. Really looked at him. Not as a risk, not as a report, as a presence the system recognized. Vanessa took a step closer. Her voice was different now. Measured, controlled. "Sir, may I confirm your name?" Caleb looked up slowly. "Caleb Wright." She nodded, as if she already knew, as if she had just needed permission to believe it. Another vibration. Now it was the cabin intercom. Captain Blake's voice came through, not loud, not commanding, careful. "Ms. Cole, please hold all further actions in your section." Vanessa froze. "Yes, Captain." "Do not initiate any protocols. Do not escalate. Remain in observation mode." Observation, not enforcement. That was new. Eric looked between them. "What's happening?" he whispered. Vanessa didn't answer, because the answer was already unfolding. The system had recognized its own creator. Not directly, not dramatically, but structurally. The evaluation feed expanded. Now it was logging. Not Caleb's tone, not Caleb's behavior. It was logging. Service delay, tone bias, protocol misuse, third-party confirmation without verification. Vanessa saw her name appear again, next to a warning symbol. Eric saw his, next to a caution tag. Richard was still smiling, still relaxed, still unaware that his words were now archived too. Caleb watched all of it, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, with clarity. Because this was never about revealing who he was. It was about forcing the system to reveal what it had been doing. Captain Blake's voice returned. "Ms. Cole, this interaction is now under review by the Compliance Board." Vanessa's face lost color. "Captain, I was only following procedure." "Procedure is what's being evaluated," Blake replied. A pause, then, "Stand by." The cabin was silent, not tense, rewritten. The balance had shifted without shouting, without accusations, without threats. Just a name, not as identity, as structure. The system had finally heard itself speak. Vanessa lowered her tablet. Eric stepped back. Richard shifted in his seat. Uncomfortable now, not because he was in danger, because the rules he had been hiding behind were suddenly visible. Caleb remained still, not elevated, not vindicated, just present. And for the first time since boarding, the cabin wasn't watching him. It was watching itself. But pause the story for just a second, right here, before the system reacts, before the screens light up, before the power shifts. Because there's a question sitting in the air that no one wants to ask. What if Caleb Wright wasn't the CEO? What if his name meant nothing to the boardroom? What if there was no acquisition, no evaluation system, no hidden authority behind his silence? What if he were just a man? Back in the cabin, nothing would have changed. Vanessa would still be standing there, tablet in hand, posture firm. Eric would still be waiting for instructions, afraid to disobey. Richard Moore would still be leaning back, confident, protected by his tone and his status. And Caleb? Caleb would still be seated, still calm, still quiet, still alone. No system would have flagged anything. No cockpit alert, no compliance review, no sudden shift in the room. Because the truth is, without power, silence is often mistaken for guilt. Without power, calm looks like surrender. Without power, dignity looks like weakness. If Caleb were just another passenger, the story would have gone very differently. They would have called security. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was inconvenient. They would have written reports, not about what they did, but about how he made them feel. They would have used words like uncooperative, suspicious, non-compliant. Language that sounds professional, but lands like a verdict. Caleb might have been escorted off the plane, not loudly, not violently, quietly, with eyes watching, with phones recording, with strangers already forming opinions. He might have been asked to explain himself, again and again and again, until his voice got tired, until his patience looked like resignation. And when it was over, there would be an apology. Polite, short, legal. We're sorry for the inconvenience. Not sorry for the humiliation. Not sorry for the assumptions. Not sorry for the way his humanity was put on trial. Just sorry for the inconvenience. That's the part that hurts the most. Not what happened because he was powerful, but what would have happened if he wasn't. Because this story feels satisfying right now. It feels like justice. But that justice arrived riding on authority, on recognition, on wealth, on a name that systems respect. And most people don't have that. Most people board planes without power behind their last name. They walk into hospitals without influence. They step into courtrooms without leverage. They stand at customer service counters with nothing but their voice. And voices without power are easy to ignore. Back on the plane, Caleb didn't change his posture. He didn't straighten up. He didn't look relieved. Because he understood something deeper than revenge. This wasn't about winning. This was about exposure. About showing what usually stays hidden. That the line between mistreatment and procedure is paper thin when no one important is watching. Vanessa thought she was enforcing standards. If Caleb were powerless, that belief would have remained unchallenged. Eric thought he was just following orders. If Caleb were powerless, that excuse would have been accepted. Richard thought he was simply stating facts. If Caleb were powerless, his bias would have sounded like authority. And Captain Blake? Silence would have stayed silence. Because without power, truth has no microphone. This isn't a story about a man who turned the tables. It's a story about how fragile dignity becomes when it isn't protected by status. Most people don't get a moment where the system suddenly listens. Most people don't get their names recognized by algorithms. Most people don't get a pause. They get processed. They get labeled. They get redirected. They get dismissed. Not because they're wrong, but because they're small in a structure that only responds to size. Caleb's presence forced a reflection, but it wasn't his calm that did it. It wasn't his patience. It wasn't his composure. It was his power. That's the uncomfortable truth. Without power, the same behavior would have been interpreted differently. Calm would have been seen as defiance. Silence would have been seen as guilt. Restraint would have been seen as resistance. And that's how injustice survives. Not loudly, not brutally, but consistently. Back in the cabin, the air was quiet now. Not peaceful, aware. Caleb sat in the same seat, wearing the same clothes, breathing the same recycled air. But his value in the room had changed. Not because he changed, because the system had finally identified him as someone worth listening to. And that's the tragedy inside the victory. That respect didn't arrive when he showed dignity. It arrived when he showed status. So ask yourself, if he were just another man in a faded jacket, if his name carried no weight, if his silence had no backing, would anyone have cared? Would anyone have paused? Would anyone have apologized? Or would the story have ended with paperwork, a forced smile, and a man walking out wondering what he did wrong? That's the real twist. Not that he was powerful, but that power was required for fairness to exist at all. The first thing that changed wasn't the tone of the room. It was the behavior of the system. Not emotion, not anger, just execution. Back in the cockpit, a new line appeared on Captain Blake's screen. Not a warning, not a suggestion, a directive. Compliance review initiated. He read it once, then again. This wasn't coming from management. It wasn't coming from headquarters. It was coming from the framework itself. The cameras had already been running. They always were. But now they weren't just recording. They were classifying. Every movement in the cabin was time-stamped. Every pause, every refusal, every escalation. Vanessa's voice, Eric's hesitation, Richard's confirmation. None of it could be edited. None of it could be reframed. The system had locked the sequence. In the cabin, Vanessa felt her control slipping before anyone said a word. Her tablet updated again. No prompts, no options, just status. Under review. She looked around. People were still seated, still breathing, still waiting. But something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't in charge anymore. Eric's screen followed. His name appeared under hers. Not accused, not condemned. Observed. He swallowed. This wasn't punishment. This was documentation. Captain Blake exhaled slowly. He pressed the intercom, not with authority, with precision. All crew, this is the captain. Remain in position. A system compliance audit is active. No one asked questions, because audits don't invite discussion. Vanessa straightened her posture out of habit, then stopped. There was nothing to perform now. Performance only matters when someone is judging. The judge was already decided. The cabin cameras adjusted their angles, quietly, automatically. They weren't looking for drama. They were collecting patterns. Caleb watched the process unfold. He didn't intervene, didn't instruct, didn't correct, because this wasn't his moment. This was the system confronting itself. Another update appeared in the cockpit. Behavioral deviation detected. Authority misuse. Captain Blake closed his eyes briefly. He had spent his career believing in procedure, in hierarchy, in clean lines between right and wrong. Now he was looking at evidence that showed something messier. Procedure had been used, hierarchy had been obeyed, and still, harm had occurred. He pressed another command: send full cabin feed to compliance. It was done instantly. Vanessa's shoulders tensed. This was no longer internal. This was structural. Her phone vibrated. Not a call, not a warning. A suspension notice. Temporary, immediate, pending investigation. Eric's came seconds later. His hands shook as he read it. Not fired. Not accused. Paused. Richard Moore finally sensed the shift. He leaned forward. "What's going on?" he asked. No one answered him, because his voice no longer carried weight. Captain Blake's notification arrived last. Flight operations suspended pending inquiry. He stared at it. Years of command, years of spotless record, and now a red line. Not because of one mistake, because of silence. He removed his headset. Not angrily, carefully, like someone setting down an object that had just become unfamiliar. Back in the cabin, Vanessa finally spoke. Not to Caleb, to the air. "This is procedural," she said. Her voice was steady, but smaller. No one argued, because she was right. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't exposure. It wasn't humiliation. It was process. The thing everyone hides behind. The thing that, when applied honestly, doesn't care who you are. Eric looked at Caleb. Not with fear, not with anger, with confusion. "You didn't say anything," he whispered. Caleb nodded slightly. "I didn't need to." The cameras kept recording. The AI system kept tagging. No faces, no emotions, just sequences of choice. Vanessa stepped back. For the first time, she wasn't leading the situation. She was inside it. Richard shifted in his seat. His confidence had no place to land. Without agreement, without reinforcement, bias collapses quickly when it loses witnesses. The cabin was quiet, not shocked, not celebratory, resolved. The system had done what no person in the room had been willing to do. It had stopped protecting itself. It had turned inward. That was the real correction, not punishment, not vindication. Alignment. Captain Blake opened the cockpit door. He walked out slowly, not as a commander, as a participant. He looked at Vanessa, then Eric, then Caleb. "I'll submit my statement," he said, not defensively, not apologetically, responsibly. Vanessa nodded. So did Eric. The story wasn't ending with handcuffs. It wasn't ending with shouting. It was ending with accountability that didn't care about rank. That's what made it different. Caleb didn't stand, didn't announce anything. He remained where he was. Because this wasn't about him being seen as powerful. It was about everyone else being seen as responsible. The cabin settled into a new kind of stillness. One where no one was pretending anymore. No one was hiding behind roles. No one was waiting for someone else to act. The system had spoken, and for once, it wasn't speaking to protect itself. It was speaking to correct itself. The cabin didn't celebrate. It didn't sigh with relief. It simply breathed again. Not because someone had won, but because something inside the room had finally been named. Caleb stayed where he was. Same seat, same posture, same quiet. Nothing about him had changed. And yet, everything around him had. People weren't watching him anymore. They were watching themselves. That's when the story stopped being about law and started being about dignity. Because justice can correct behavior, but dignity corrects identity. And not everyone has the power to summon a system. Not everyone has a name that makes algorithms listen. So the real question becomes something else. When you don't have power, what do you protect yourself with? When you can't escalate, what do you hold on to? Because most people don't get a Caleb moment. They don't get an audit. They don't get a pause. They get life. They get silence. They get being misunderstood. They get being judged by posture, tone, and appearance. So what stands between them and humiliation? Calm. Not the kind that surrenders, the kind that refuses to become ugly just because someone else is. Caleb never raised his voice, never demanded attention, never begged to be believed. He didn't shrink, but he also didn't perform. He didn't match their aggression. He didn't mirror their disrespect. That was his first protection, because when you lose control of your behavior, you hand your dignity to the person trying to take it. Caleb didn't win because he was rich. He won because for the entire flight, he never stepped out of his humanity, not even when they did. That's the part we rarely talk about. We celebrate power. We celebrate exposure. We celebrate when systems finally listen. But long before any system moved, Caleb had already decided who he was, and he refused to become anything smaller. That's how you protect dignity when you have nothing else. By staying clean inside. By keeping your behavior intact, so that when truth arrives, it stands on solid ground. Not everyone can change a room, but everyone can protect their posture inside it. Caleb didn't win by overpowering anyone. He won by never lowering himself to their level. That's a different kind of strength, and it's available to anyone. Because dignity isn't something you prove. It's something you carry. Most people think respect is something you earn, with credentials, with money, with position, with approval. But dignity was never meant to be earned. It exists before permission, before validation, before agreement. You don't have dignity because someone gives it to you. You have dignity because you are a human being. Caleb didn't walk into that cabin trying to prove he belonged. He already knew he did, and that certainty is what made everything else collapse. Vanessa thought dignity came from authority. When her authority was removed, her sense of worth fell with it. Eric thought dignity came from obedience. When obedience failed him, he didn't know who he was without it. Richard thought dignity came from superiority. When his superiority wasn't protected, his voice lost its power. Caleb was the only one whose dignity wasn't borrowed. It wasn't built on rank. It wasn't built on fear. It wasn't built on approval. It was internal. And that's why it didn't move. He didn't need to prove he was worthy of respect, because respect doesn't create dignity. Dignity creates respect. The tragedy is that most systems reverse that order. They make dignity conditional on how you look, on how you speak, on how useful you are, on how powerful your name sounds. That's not dignity, that's permission. And permission can always be taken away. Caleb didn't need permission to remain human. That's why, even when everything turned in his favor, he didn't change his posture. He didn't stand taller. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't claim victory. Because this was never about being above anyone. It was about staying whole. And that's the difference. Power lifts you above others. Dignity keeps you level with yourself. Most people chase power because they're afraid of being invisible. Caleb didn't chase visibility. He carried integrity. That's why when the system finally listened, it wasn't impressive. It was inevitable. Not because he was powerful, because he was consistent. Because dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't perform. It just stands and waits. When the cabin finally quieted, Caleb remained exactly where he had always been, not elevated, not reduced, just human. That's the part we should remember, not the audit, not the suspensions, not the reversal of power, but the posture of a man who never stopped being himself, even when everything around him tried to tell him he was less. That's what real justice points toward. Not punishment, not exposure, but restoration of worth. And worth was never missing. It was just being ignored. Caleb didn't need to show his status to earn dignity. He carried it before anyone knew who he was. That's why this isn't a story about a CEO who outsmarted a system. It's a story about a man who never gave the system permission to define his value. And that's something no title can give you, and no system can take away. This wasn't just a plane. It never was. It only looked like one. Because what happened in that cabin happens everywhere else, just with different uniforms and different rules. In hospitals, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in government offices, in job interviews, in police stations. Anywhere a door closes and authority begins, the same risk appears. Power without witnesses. Back on the plane, the seats were still leather. The lights were still warm. The aisle was still narrow. But now it felt like a mirror, not of aviation, of society. Because the cabin wasn't special. It was familiar. A small space, clear hierarchy, limited oversight, and a quiet rule that everyone understood without saying it. Who gets comfort? Who gets patience? Who gets believed? And who has to earn their humanity every time they speak? This wasn't about flight service. It was about how systems behave when they think no one important is watching. In a hospital, it sounds like delayed care. In a school, it sounds like lowered expectations. In a courtroom, it sounds like assumed guilt. In a government office, it sounds like endless paperwork and closed windows. Different language, same message. Wait your turn. Know your place. Don't make trouble. Because closed spaces create power. And power without accountability always tests its limits. Vanessa didn't wake up planning to be cruel. Neither did Eric. Neither did Richard. They were practicing something far more dangerous. Normality. The normality of believing your authority is unquestionable. The normality of deciding who deserves effort. The normality of using rules to protect yourself, not people. That's how abuse begins. Not with violence, with convenience. With small decisions that go unchecked. With silence that feels like permission. On the plane, the doors were sealed. No press, no supervisors, no public eyes. Just a system and the people it controlled. That's not unique to aviation. That's bureaucracy. That's hierarchy. That's how every institution becomes dangerous when it forgets who it serves. Hospitals are meant to heal, but they can also dismiss. They can minimize pain. They can decide who is overreacting and who is serious. Schools are meant to build futures, but they can also label. They can limit. They can decide who is promising and who is trouble. Courts are meant to protect fairness, but they can also protect patterns. They can confuse procedure with justice. And government offices are meant to serve citizens, but they can also hide behind policy. They can delay until dignity expires. Different buildings, same risk. Because anytime humans manage other humans, power appears. And power always asks one question: who can stop me? On that flight, they believed the answer was no one. That's why their behavior escalated, not because Caleb was threatening, but because they felt safe being careless. That's how systemic injustice works. It doesn't require hatred. It only requires confidence. Confidence that your actions won't be reviewed. Confidence that your decisions won't be challenged. Confidence that the person in front of you doesn't matter. The most dangerous spaces in society are not violent ones. They're quiet ones, where people obey, where procedures flow, where harm looks like professionalism, where suffering gets labeled as policy. The cabin was a classroom, a courtroom, a hospital waiting room, a DMV line, a police stop, all in one. Caleb didn't represent a single passenger. He represented anyone who has ever entered a space and felt smaller. Anyone who has ever had to explain themselves twice. Anyone who has ever been spoken to slowly, sharply, or suspiciously. Anyone who has ever watched someone else get kindness they were denied. The flight just made it visible. And that's why this story matters beyond aviation. Because injustice doesn't need cruelty to survive. It only needs routine. It only needs indifference. It only needs people who confuse authority with virtue. Vanessa thought she was enforcing order. Richard thought he was protecting standards. Eric thought he was avoiding trouble. Captain Blake thought silence was neutrality. But silence is never neutral. Silence always sides with whoever holds power. That's the rule everywhere. In a hospital, silence sides with the doctor. In a classroom, silence sides with the teacher. In a courtroom, silence sides with the judge. In a police stop, silence sides with the officer. And when silence goes unquestioned, power grows comfortable. Comfortable power stops checking itself. Comfortable power stops seeing people. It only sees compliance. That's why accountability matters, not just for punishment, but for memory. So systems remember who they exist for. On the plane, accountability arrived late. It usually does. In real life, it often never comes. That's what makes this story unsettling. Not because justice happened, but because it usually doesn't. Most people never get their moment of reversal. They don't get an algorithm. They don't get an audit. They don't get a revelation. They just carry the experience forward, into their work, into their parenting, into their trust in institutions. That's how damage multiplies. One quiet injustice becomes 1,000 cautious lives. That's why every closed space needs something more powerful than authority. It needs humility. The humility to remember that position doesn't equal correctness. The humility to remember that rules don't replace empathy. The humility to remember that humans are not procedures. When systems lose humility, they become machines, efficient, predictable, cold. They stop protecting people. They start protecting themselves. And that's when injustice becomes normalized, not dramatic, not visible, just accepted. Caleb's story forces a question that applies everywhere. Who watches the watchers? Who protects people when the system is tired, rushed, or careless? Because every institution eventually faces that test, not when everything is calm, but when no one is paying attention. The cabin passed that test only because it was forced to, not because it was ready, and that should make us uncomfortable. Because society runs on thousands of cabins every day. Rooms where decisions are made quietly, where tone decides outcomes, where posture becomes judgment, where dignity is either honored or ignored. This wasn't just one man on one flight. It was a demonstration of how fragile fairness is, how easily respect can be withdrawn, how quickly authority can become entitlement, and how much harm can happen without anyone raising their voice. If this story feels familiar, it's because it is. We've all stood in a version of that aisle, waiting to be seen, waiting to be believed, waiting to be treated like we matter. The setting changes. The power dynamics don't, which means the responsibility doesn't either. Every closed space needs conscience. Every system needs memory. Every authority needs limits. Because once power forgets its purpose, it doesn't become stronger. It becomes dangerous. And that danger doesn't stay inside planes. It shapes societies. Caleb didn't walk off that plane as a winner. He walked off as a reminder, not of power, not of wealth, not of position, but of something quieter. He never raised his voice. He never demanded special treatment. He never asked who was in charge. He only stayed still. And sometimes, staying still is the strongest form of resistance. Because respect was never supposed to be negotiated. It was never meant to be earned through status. It was never meant to be unlocked by authority. It was meant to be given first. That's the part we forget. We live in a world that teaches people to wait. Wait until you're promoted. Wait until you're successful. Wait until your voice matters. Then you'll be treated better. Then you'll be heard. Then you'll be human. But dignity doesn't work like that. It doesn't begin at the top. It begins at the ground. And if it only exists for the powerful, then it was never dignity to begin with. It was privilege. Caleb didn't win because he was a CEO. He was respected because he never acted like one. He didn't weaponize his identity. He didn't reveal it to control the moment. He let the system expose itself first. That took restraint. That took faith in truth over ego. And most people will never have that kind of leverage. Which is why the real lesson is uncomfortable. If respect only comes when power enters the room, then the room was already broken. Because justice that depends on hierarchy isn't justice. It's permission. And permission can always be withdrawn. We teach people to chase influence so they can be safe. But safety built on power isn't safety. It's dependence. It teaches silence. It teaches fear. It teaches compliance. Caleb didn't demand respect. He carried it. In his posture, in his tone, in his refusal to become smaller. That's what made the room uncomfortable. Not his authority, his calm. Because calm doesn't ask for approval. Calm doesn't beg to be believed. Calm doesn't shrink. It just exists. And that existence exposes every system that depends on intimidation. You don't need to be powerful to be dignified. You need to be grounded. You need to be steady. You need to know that who you are doesn't change based on who is watching. That's not weakness. That's independence. The world is full of people waiting for permission to matter. Permission from bosses, from institutions, from authority. But dignity doesn't require signatures. It requires courage. The courage to speak calmly. The courage to stay composed. The courage to refuse to mirror disrespect. That's the kind of power that doesn't make headlines, but it reshapes rooms. Caleb's story isn't about revenge, it's about integrity. And integrity doesn't shout. It doesn't posture. It doesn't perform. It just holds its shape. That's why the most powerful people are rarely loud. They don't need to be. They already know who they are. And that's what systems can't control. You may never own a company. You may never sit in a boardroom. You may never design an algorithm. But you will walk into rooms. You will face judgment. You will meet authority. And in those moments, you get a choice. Do you shrink? Or do you stand? Not aggressively, not defiantly, just truthfully. Because dignity isn't something people grant you. It's something you refuse to surrender. Caleb didn't change the world that day. He showed it to itself. And sometimes, that's enough to begin. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not an accident. Discomfort means recognition. It means you saw something familiar, something real. Not about planes, about power. And if you've ever felt small in a space that claimed to be fair, you already understand the message. Respect should never be delayed. Humanity should never be conditional. Dignity should never require credentials. So don't wait to be powerful to expect respect. Carry it now. Protect it now. Practice it now. For yourself and for others. And if this story gave you language for something you've felt but never named, share it. Not for drama, not for revenge, but so more people remember this simple truth. We don't become worthy when we rise. We rise when we remember we were always worthy.